Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at G.Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of chats with leading scholars in the field. And I'm delighted to today be joined by Francois Burgat of CNRS in Paris and one of the longtime observers of Islamist movements in the region, currently doing more work on Syria. But I thought we might begin our conversation by saying welcome to GW.
It's a great pleasure and a great honor.
Well, let me start by asking you about your experience of studying Islamic movements over the years. I've been reading your books since I was in graduate school, and you have a long perspective on the evolution of these movements. How do you think they've changed over the course of the years that you've been studying them?
Why, they indeed changed more than I did in my in my approach of the Islamic movement. In just a few words, my theory, my angle was to say that there is no Islamic thinking that would not change. There is a period of history where citizens of an entire area which has been dominated by the West through colonial power, whose culture has been marginalized, devalorized through the hegemony of the West, who is against willing to use what is perceived as the homemade terminology, who is willing to speak Muslim, as I put it. Now, the fact that they speak Muslim is a transnational, trans-social dynamic. You don't have to be rich or poor to speak Muslim. Every single individual has the feeling that he is more comfortable when he's using the terminology that his grandfather was using. So that's my main point. And then I say, how do I behave when I speak Muslim? And I say, I do not know. I have to go on the field and see a huge variety of using this Muslim terminology. So my main way of addressing changes in the landscape is to say the word Islamism is no longer functional, because almost every single compartment of the political scene has more or less to speak Muslim, cannot go against this identitarian dynamic. But the way they speak Muslim can make them conservative or modernist. They can make them willing to adopt most of the so-called Western values when they do not, strictly speaking, contradicts what they look at their values. So they change in the sense that almost every single compartment of Arab societies nowadays is Islamist. So we ought to get rid of this concept and go closer to the wide variety of what it means to be from Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Muslim Brotherhood, or a Salafi, or etc., etc.
And one thing which I really remember from your first books, The Islamic Movement in North Africa, and also Face to Face with Political Islam, were the stories that you were able to tell of the movement of intellectuals, some of them liberal, some leftist, into the Islamist camp and how they came into this. Do you see anything like that happening now with people moving out of the Islamist camp? The same kind of transformative experience that people had in the 1960s?
This is indeed, if I may say, a good question. At least it's the hardcore of my methodology has been to ask individuals, not only intellectuals, why did you become an Islamist? Okay? And this was my way to get in. And in this conference that we are having together within hours in Washington, I intended to make a parallel between the narrative of a Salafi, a Tunisian Salafi whom I met a couple of weeks ago, who said to me, you know, we were so disappointed when Ghannouchi came to power. When these guys came to power, we had the impression that we had been treated like enemies. And this sounded very strange in my brain because it reminded me the very same discourse of Ghannouchi 20 years ago, labeling the Islamists les vaincus de l'armée de Bourguiba, those who were defeated by Bourguiba, in the sense that our situation in terms of being Muslim became worse when the Tunisians took over than it was with the colonial power. And the Salafis nowadays, to a certain extent, say to the Muslim brothers, oh, you made it worse. You respect less our Islamic identity than the secularist, the lousy secularist friend of Bourguiba used to do. So yes, indeed, there's a circle of a historical circle where you see political activists move toward Islamism in terms of authenticity. Is this circle completed? Is it finished? Have we moved to the post-Islamist era? My conviction is that no way. We are in a longer temporality than just no more Islamist after 2 weeks. And I keep taking the example of Iran. In Iran, a government may be defeated, an Islamic government may be defeated, but it doesn't mean that the next government will not be Islamist. The next government will be Islamist and will propose a different interpretation of the religious norm. But this period of time when people feel comfortable because they are using a terminology which they look at as homemade, as fueling their need to bring the West to, I say, give the symbolic identification of the other to the West, make the West again an other. This is not finished. So I think that we are still in the temporality of the Islamic movement.
But what do you make of Egypt, where you've had this very strong state-led public backlash against the Muslim Brotherhood? Does that surprise you, or does that make you rethink?
I stick to what I just said. First of all, I tend to minimize the public backlash, which has to a great extent been manipulated by the militaries in power from inside most of the state apparatus. But the fact that one Islamic government has failed to a certain extent, because it's military violence which has succeeded, not the Ikhwan who have failed. We would have needed a poll. We would have needed people voting against the Ikhwan, and this never occurred. But it is not the mere fact that a government who was labeled Islamist as, to a certain extent, failed, which allows us to say that the Islamic period of history has vanished.
One of the most compelling personalities in your books that runs through the various books is Rashid Ghannouchi. And I'm curious how you would evaluate his performance in power. You've seen him living in exile, you saw his return, you documented his turn to Islam. How would you evaluate him now after the last couple of years in Tunis?
Allow me to take you for a little trip in Libya. That's where I was last week. I was in Libya and I saw, I was exposed to all the problems of the Libyan government, facing this society where the demands of every single compartment is such after 42 years of authoritarianism that it cannot handle the situation. Very few commentators, very few analysts make the point that, hey, there are a lot of problems in Libya, but we cannot blame them on the Islamists since they were not in power. See? So my main point, probably the main point I would like to do in this conference, is that the trouble faced by those who won the elections, I don't want even to refer to Islamism, are related to the period of time when they come to power, the circumstances of their accessing to power, much more than it can be related to their being Islamist.
So for Ghannouchi, you see this as a
for
problem of
Ghannouchi,
transitional government rather than...
So for Ghannouchi, whom I met last month, and there was some emotion because Ghannouchi, whom I had met a year ago in Doha, said, "See, Francois, you were the one who was right," because very few analysts would say that they were going to win elections when they were tortured and expelled in exile. So Ghannouchi, I think, has had to face this very specific combination of opposition in Tunis, which are a very vocal, very radical leftists who know they have no popular support. Because those who are the most vocal against the Islamists, they made 3% in the ballot boxes. We should remember. But this coalition of the 3% vocal left with the forces linked to the previous regime is, and the sympathy of the Western environment, and the sympathy of many Arab leaders, whom I label the dictators without borders. You know, those who are not so happy that a popular mobilization could end such a nice regime as the Algerian one or the Saudi or the Emirati. They had to face all these difficulties, local and regional. And what they have done is kind of deserve some kind of a medal, because they stepped out of power without violence, and they are getting ready for a new democratic examination through the polls. And let me tell you my prospect. The fact that they will be out of power for the next 2 years will demonstrate that those problems which have been faced by the Tunisian society were not, in their vast majority, the result of the government being partly Islamist. It was the result of the very specific period of time which they have to face after so many years of authoritarianism.
So you think we're still very much within an Islamist era?
Yeah, we are not out. We are not out. But we will be out of an Islamist era, first of all, when we will see a counter ideology, another dream than the Islamic one. A dream, not a counter ideology. I see nowadays in this part of the world no reservoir of dream except in the Islamic vocabulary, as being, as I have said and repeat, as being the home-made resource that we can oppose to the still harsh hegemony of the West.
All right, thank you, Francois Burgat. Thank you for joining us with the POMEPS Conversation Series, and thanks for coming to Washington.
Thank you.